I now call Brendan O'Hara to move the motion. Point of order. Oh, wait.
I appreciate what you've outlined here, but I seek your advice because obviously I've taken advice from the clerks. This is the SNP's opposition day. Yep. And the purpose of an opposition day is for our party to have the ability to put forward our business. We've already had a significant delay to the start of this motion, which has significant interest to the extent we dropped our second motion, and now we're completely appear to be doing things in a way that's never been done before. Can I ask for your advice, Mr. Speaker, and what is the point of an opposition day if it's going to be done like this?
And then, can I just say, I think you will want to vote at some point. Clapping isn't going to assist it. A point of order has been raised by the SNP Chief Whip. As I say, I've made a judgment on a precedent that's been done before. I have viewed it as that is my ruling, and I'm going to stand by the ruling, and I'm not taking any more points of order. Brendan O'Hara. No more. Brendan O'Hara. Speak. Brendan O'Hara, I'm not taking any more points of order, Mr. Linden. Brendan O'Hara.
Yeah, I know. Mr. Speaker, I beg to move the SNP motion that has been tabled in my name and those of my right honourable friends, which calls for an immediate ceasefire in Gaza from all combatants. And I wish to put on record, once again, our unequivocal condemnation of the Hamas attack of October the 7th, and repeat both our call for the immediate release of all the hostages and to see those involved in those atrocities called to account for their actions.
Hear, hear.
The war in Gaza is one of the great defining moments of our time. Yet, until today, this House has not been given the opportunity to debate both the unfolding human catastrophe and the wider implications for regional and global stability. Nor have we had the opportunity to debate the urgent and pressing need for an immediate ceasefire as an essential first step to finding a lasting and just peace. Mr. Speaker, no one would deny that Israel has the right to defend itself. Every country has that right. What no country has the right to do, however, is to lay siege to a civilian population, carpet bomb densely inhabited areas, drive people from their homes, erase an entire civilian infrastructure, and impose a collective punishment involving the cutting off of water, electricity, food and medicine from civilians. And no country, regardless of who they are, in the name of self-defence, can kill civilians at such a pace and on such a scale that in just 16 weeks, almost 30,000 are known to have died, with a further 80,000 injured. Mr. Speaker, we cannot allow the core principle of self-defence to be so ruthlessly exploited and manipulated in order to legitimise the slaughter of innocent civilians. If we do that, then what hope is there for the future of international rules-based order? An order created to protect people from atrocities, not to be used as a smokescreen to hide the execution of them. If we accept what Israel is doing in Gaza as the new norm, as the new accepted standard of self-defence, then we undermine that core principle which is meant to protect and defend us. And therefore we cannot accept that what is happening now is self-defence, not just because of the precedent that it will send. And I have no doubt that that thought contributed to the United States issuing its clearest warning yet to Netanyahu, that they would not support his proposed ground offensive in Rafah. And this is why the UN Security Council are currently debating a ceasefire. And as we speak today, and even the US have recognised that a ceasefire must happen for a peaceful political solution. Of course, it does not go nearly far enough, but it does show that things are moving, opinions are changing, and the guarantees Israel has come to rely upon are gradually withdrawing. Oh, sorry.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. I think there are very few people, not only in this House, but in this country at the moment, who would differ from the sentiments being expressed by the Scottish National Party spokesperson here today. We all watch with horror each night the torture of the people in Gaza, and we remember every morning the pain being felt by the families whose loved ones are being held hostage. But would the honourable member not agree with me that we would serve their cause so much better, and ourselves in this place, if we built a consensus behind an opinion today, rather than indulging in petty party politics, which serves no one well?
I thank the honourable lady for the intervention. I'm not quite sure she means about petty party politics, and the behaviour we're seeing today has been petty, but we are all about consensus. Anything that can build a consensus for peace, which has to be based around peace, justice and an immediate ceasefire, then we will be there.
Very grateful for the honourable member for giving way. If I could just highlight something that I think is more important than some of the conversations we've had to this moment. On Monday, the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights released a statement saying that UN experts had uncovered that Israeli forces in Gaza and the West Bank are being accused of egregious human rights abuses, including arbitrary detention, extrajudicial killings and sexual violence, including rape. The Israeli government, of course, have dismissed this without any investigation. Does the honourable member agree with me that this government should be pushing hard for a proper investigation for people to be held to account for these kinds of gross human rights abuses?
Absolutely. I absolutely agree with my honourable friend. I think it is vitally important that whether it's a perceived ally or a perceived foe, an egregious breach of human rights is an egregious breach of human rights and should be taken as exactly that and should be investigated without fear or favour.
I'm very grateful to my honourable friend. I think one of the things which has defined this House over the last couple of years has been the unity over Ukraine, and it's been really important that we've all stood together on all sides against Putin. Can I just appeal to my honourable friend to reflect on what's required of all of us today, because the issue is one of principle, of those that are facing famine and death in Gaza. And it's important on all of us across this House to show the appropriate leadership, to come together, to speak up against the human rights abuses that are taking place. And woe betide any of us that fail to show that particular leadership. Now is the time, today is the time, for this House to come together and stand up for those in Palestine that need our support.
I do agree with my honourable friend, and I think we all have a part to play in bringing peace and saving innocent lives. So I was somewhat surprised to hear the Shadow Foreign Secretary on Sunday when he seemed to dismiss and downplay the importance of this debate when he said on the radio, it's not this vote that will bring about a ceasefire. And of course, he is right. Voting for an immediate ceasefire today won't by itself bring about the end of the slaughter. But the impact and the optics of this Parliament Hitherto one of Israel's staunchest allies, saying enough is enough and calling for an immediate ceasefire would be enormous. And while not in and of itself able to bring about a ceasefire, support for this motion would further remove that ever-thinning veil of legitimacy that the UK's continued support gives to Israel's merciless war in Gaza. And it would show the beleaguered and battered people of Palestine that we do care and that we have not forgotten them. And calling for an immediate ceasefire would also be a pivotal moment in the campaign to stop UK arms sales to Israel. Because, as the South African Foreign Minister said last week, the decision to stop the fighting in Gaza is in the hands of the countries that supply Israel with their weapons. And who knows, it might actually help some of the UK's political establishment and those seeking to aspire to that position to locate their moral compass.
I thank the honourable member for giving way. He refers to the way of stopping the conflict. Does he not agree with me that the only way, the most certain way of ending this conflict is by Hamas releasing the hostages, including the 9-month-old baby who was kidnapped by Hamas? And if Hamas released the hostages straight away, that is a surefire way to ceasefire, and that is what we should be talking about.
Send the motion.
I think the very first sentence I said was we utterly condemn the Hamas attack and we implore them to release the hostages, but there has to be a pathway to reaching that. And so the Shadow Foreign Secretary, when he said that this would not bring about a ceasefire, was right. But to try and downplay the importance of this motion does not serve him well. And I do suspect that these moments do not come around very often, as he knows, and he understands only too well the importance of tonight's vote. Because it's moments like these, which shape the ethical identity of a country. And it's the decisions that we take now which will reverberate down the decades, and they will define who we are and what we stand for. And that is why we are calling so clearly and unambiguously for an immediate ceasefire. Because anything else presupposes that there can be a military solution to this conflict. And any other form of words threatens to give credence to the idea that Israel, by dint of deploying its massive military capacity in Gaza, that will somehow be enough to destroy Hamas. When in reality, as everyone knows, and indeed history tells us, the only possible solution to this crisis is a political solution.
For the purpose of clarity, I could understand his argument better if he were talking about what the Americans seem to call a temporary ceasefire to see if more hostages could be released. But he appears to be calling for an unconditional ceasefire, which, and I see people nodding, which would leave all the hostages at the mercy of Hamas. And does not that put Israel in the position where previously they had to release 1,000 people who had been criminally convicted to get one soldier back, and one of the people they released was the person who organised the Hamas atrocities on the 7th of October.
I thank the honourable member for that. I am absolutely clear. There has to be a roadway. There has to be a path towards peace. And that has to start with an immediate ceasefire. If it doesn't, then there is no pathway. I will address directly the issue of humanitarian pauses in a moment. But, Mr. Speaker, when the SNP last called for a vote on the ceasefire on the 15th of November, the death toll in Gaza stood at 11,320. Already a heartbreaking number of people killed. Just yesterday, Johns Hopkins University and the London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine released their analysis, which showed that if this conflict continues on the same trajectory, there will be between 58,000 and 75,000 additional civilian Palestinian deaths in the next 6 months. So we know categorically what the consequences of inaction will be, and no one can in the future claim that they did not know or that they did not understand the consequences of what they were doing tonight. Absolutely.
Very grateful to him for giving way. Does my honourable friend agree that while some rules may be more malleable than others, the rules of international law are very clear on self-defence, and that the use of self-defence must be proportionate, and that on any view, 30,000 civilians dead, the majority of whom are women and children, is excessive and not a proportionate use of force?
I thank my honourable friend for that, and she's absolutely right. And the danger that we have is if we accept Israel's response as being the new norm, then the danger that everybody across the world, regardless of their circumstances, are put in is terrifying. It's a terrifying example to set and a terrifying precedent which should worry us all, and I thank her for that intervention. And to address the point from earlier on from the honourable member, if no one can argue, I believe, with any credibility on what they used to call, and some people still do, humanitarian pauses, that convoluted idea of an organised fixed-term pause in the killing, one which would allow emergency aid into Gaza only to have the carnage resume at a pre-arranged date and time. And I think that should be seen for what it always was, a smokescreen for politicians to hide behind while waiting to see which direction the wind of public opinion might blow. Well, we have seen the way that public opinion is blowing across the world and here in the UK, with millions taking to the streets and polls showing 75% support plus for an immediate ceasefire. And the harsh reality is that the government, having expended so much political and diplomatic capital on defending and justifying Israel's prosecution of this war, now finds itself stuck on the wrong side of global opinion. And consequently, the UK's international reputation has been so diminished that when the process of finding a just, lasting peace in the region does begin, the UK will struggle to play a meaningful part in it. So if this government cannot see the long-term damage that it is doing, then it's up to this House to tell them by demanding that immediate ceasefire, an immediate ceasefire which has already been endorsed by Pope Francis, the Archbishop of Canterbury, the moderator of the General Assembly of the Church of Scotland, the Archbishop of York, Scotland's Catholic bishops, the Catholic bishops of the Conference of England and Wales, the Church of England's House of Bishops, the Muslim Council of Britain, the Quakers, the leaders of the Methodists and the United Reformed Church, the Lutheran World Federation, the UN Secretary-General, the UN General Assembly President, UNICEF, the World Food Programme, the World Health Organization, Save the Children, Amnesty, Médecins Sans Frontières, Oxfam, ActionAid, the International Rescue Committee, Action Against Hunger, Care International, Medical Aid for Palestinians, the Council for Arab-British Understanding, the Balfour Project, Islamic Relief, Christian Aid, War on Want, the Carter Centre, War Child, Unite the Union, Unison, the King Centre, World Vision, WaterAid, Tear Fund, Street Child, Star Network, Peace Direct, Mercy Corps, Civicus, and scores more of churches, NGOs, charities and individuals who have seen Israel completely abandon international humanitarian law by imposing their collective punishment on a defenceless civilian population. A civilian population in which just 16 weeks an estimated 18,000 Palestinian children have been left without a single living relative.
The honourable member for giving way. The only way we can ensure a permanent end to the cycle of violence is by facilitating the establishment of a sovereign Palestinian state alongside Israel. The main blocker to this is Prime Minister Netanyahu, who has doubled down on his opposition to an independent Palestinian state. Does my honourable friend agree that the UK must show strong opposition to Netanyahu's plans by unilaterally recognising the state of Palestine as a matter of urgency?
I could not agree more with my honourable friend. Absolutely. The United Kingdom has shown a dereliction of duty towards the Palestinians, and we have been very, very supportive and will continue to be supportive of a Palestinian state. But all of those organisations and individuals and churches that I listed, they will not ignore the evidence of their own eyes, nor will they turn a deaf ear to the cries of suffering Palestinians, and neither should we. Mr. Speaker, the Palestinian poet Mahmoud Darwish once wrote, "In silence we become accomplices, but when we speak, every word has the power to change the world." So, as I bring these remarks to a close, I want to share with the House the words of those being forced to live through this hell every single day. 30-year-old Islam Harb lost 3 of his 4 children, along with his mother, 2 of his sisters, and both his brothers, when a missile hit their home. Islam said, "My family spent days trying to dig the remains of the dead out of the rubble. The body of my brother Khalil was found 200 metres away from the house due to the power of the strike, in pieces. My children's small bodies were torn to pieces." His surviving sister, Ahlam, added, "My brother Mohammed was only recognised by his hair. Nothing was left of my brother Khalil except his hand." And 30-year-old Ahmad Nassam, a physiotherapist, lost his wife and 3 children, aged 5, 4 and just 3 months, along with both of his parents and his sister, when a missile hit their home. He said it took him 4 days to retrieve the body of his baby daughter, Isla, from the rubble. She was only recognised by the clothes she was wearing. That same blast decapitated his 5-year-old daughter, Arwa. He said, "When the war started, I had only one mission in my life: to protect my children. I wish I were with them when the house was hit. My body survived, but my spirit died with my children. It was crushed under the rubble with them." And that's why tonight really matters. That's why it'll be times like these for which we are all remembered. We will be remembered for what we did and for what we chose not to do. And for decades hence, people will say to us, "You were there," and they will ask us, "What did you do?" And some will have to say they chose to engage in a debate on semantics over sustainable or humanitarian causes, while others will say that they chose to give Netanyahu both the weapons and the political cover he required to allow him to prosecute his relentless war. But some of us in this House can say, when we saw 30,000 innocent people killed, when we saw almost 100,000 innocent people injured, when we saw tens of thousands of traumatised children with physical and mental damage that will last for the rest of their lives, when we saw 2 million people displaced from their homes, when we saw refugee camps bombed, when we saw hundreds of journalists killed, when we see hospitals reduced to rubble, when we saw places of worship and the people sheltering in them attacked, and when we saw ambulances which had been sent to rescue children being hit by missiles with those rescued children still inside, at that point we will say that we chose to do everything we possibly could to make it stop. But we also chose to listen. We listened to the International Court of Justice when they determined there were plausible grounds that Israel is in the process of committing genocide. We listened to the anguished pleas of innocent Palestinians begging for our help to make it stop. And we listened to the anger of millions of people from across these islands. And then we used our immensely privileged position as members of this House to demand an immediate ceasefire. So by supporting the SNP's motion tonight calling for that immediate ceasefire, this House can put itself on the side of peace, it can put itself on the side of justice, it can put itself on the side of the people, and it can put itself on the right side of history.
The question is, as on the order, order. Can I just say to members clapping, I have a list, and I can rule who speaks where. So I think we need to hear a debate, not a debating society. The original question was as on the order paper, since when the amendment has been proposed as on the order paper. The question is that the amendment now be made. Mhairi Black.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Now, I want to begin with something that Frankie Boyle actually said. And he pointed out that it makes no sense to say that the situation in Gaza is too complex for a ceasefire, because ceasefire is one of the oldest and simplest terms to understand. It means stop firing. In fact, it's so simple that it's actually designed to be heard and understood in the middle of a literal battle. So there is no middle ground when it comes to a ceasefire. You either follow the order or you don't. You either stop firing or you don't. Now, during the 2014 crisis, there was an estimated 2,251 Palestinian deaths. The then Prime Minister rightly called for an immediate and unconditional ceasefire. But if we fast forward 10 years to the current conflict, we have a death toll of nearly 30,000. And that's not including the bodies that have yet to be recovered from underneath the rubble. And yet the very same man, now Foreign Secretary, is failing to support a ceasefire. And that number, nearly 70,000 people have also been injured. So according to Amnesty International, the death rate in Gaza right now is 1 death every 4 minutes. It won't just be bombs that are killing Palestinians, it's poor sanitation and malnutrition as well now. We know that people are starving, people being reduced to eating grass and animal feed. In January last month, over half of all aid deliveries were denied access and could not get through to those who currently need it. Less than half of hospitals in Gaza are even partially functioning, and the few that are will quickly run out of supplies unless Israel allows aid through. Now, since 2008, Israel have refused entry to any UN agency individuals, which to me is a giant red flag in and of itself. But despite these attempts to shield themselves and hide from any accountability, we know that war crimes are being committed in Gaza. Churches sheltering hundreds of innocent Palestinians being bombed to the ground. There's been strikes against people in refugee camps and hospitals. Just earlier this week, there was reports that Israeli forces ordered the evacuation of a hospital only to start sniper fire on those who attempted to leave, leaving 2,500 folks still trapped in the hospital. Israel's own Minister of Defence said that there would be, and I quote, a complete siege on Gaza. No electricity, no food, no water, no gas. Now, as the occupying power, Israel has an obligation under international law to ensure the basic needs of Gaza's civilian population are met. They are not doing that. Now, the International Court of Justice specifically directed Israel to take immediate and effective measures to enable the provision of basic services and humanitarian assistance. They are not doing that. Yet Israel still refuses to reinstate the water supply they so cruelly shut off months ago. They're stopping medicine getting in, they're stopping food entering Gaza, and despite the growing likelihood of famine that they will have created, they still are not budging. Now, the actions of Hamas, let's be absolutely clear, They were horrific and unjustifiable. But as I said earlier to the Shadow Minister, the people of Palestine are not Hamas. Israel's disproportionate and indiscriminate bombing of civilians, combined with everything else that we know, has got to be the very definition of collective punishment, which, as we all know, is illegal under international law. It's a war crime. And this is why it's so important how this place responds. Because in many respects, the ending of the violence in Gaza rests in the hands of the countries supplying the money and the weapons to Israel. Now, the Arms Trade Treaty bans the sale of weapons where there is a concern that they may be used to breach international law. Well, given the International Court of Justice has found that there's a plausible risk that Israel is committing genocide, it is upon the UK to revoke all arms licences and military equipment to Israel. Otherwise, we break the own treaties that we've signed up to. Frankly, warm words and platitudes will not cut it. Only action will. Now, that's one death every 4 minutes. And the time that this debate happens today, and we all talk amongst ourselves, 100 more people will be dead that were alive this morning. The least we can do is call for a ceasefire. Because if we don't, we will be morally and directly complicit in every single life lost and every single family destroyed in Gaza. The route to peace, the route to justice, the route to any humane conclusion to this begins with an immediate and unconditional ceasefire, because anything less from us and future generations will quite rightly never forgive us or forget.
Indicated order, please. A number of members have indicated a desire to withdraw, but I still think we're going to be playing beat the clock, so I'm going to drop the time limit now to 4 minutes. Allan Dorrans.
Thank you, Mr Deputy Speaker, and good afternoon. Mr Deputy Speaker, much has been said of the deaths and suffering of civilians in Gaza, and I add my condemnation of those responsible on both sides in this conflict. In the brief time allowed today, I wish to highlight briefly the role of risk taken by 3 specific groups of people which receive little media coverage. These are the humanitarian aid workers, health workers and journalists. We all owe them a great debt of gratitude for the work that they carry out in the most dangerous circumstances in areas of extreme conflict and suffering, with the ever-present risk of death, serious injury and disease. Mr Deputy Speaker, since the 7th of October, at least 136 staff members of the United Nations Humanitarian Aid Organisation have been killed in Gaza. The International Agency's Secretary-General, Antonio Guterres, said recently that throughout the United Nations history, they had never witnessed the deaths of their staff in such large numbers. Mr Deputy Speaker, turning to health workers, at least 300 health workers have been killed during this conflict. The killing of aid workers and health workers is both unacceptable and illegal. The World Medical Association has made this clear repeatedly, and in 2002 said, "The right to health is a fundamental element of human rights, which does not change in situations of conflict and violence. Access to medical assistance for the sick and wounded, whether they have been engaged in active combat or not, is guaranteed through various international agreements, including those of the Geneva Convention and the United Nations. Israel and those nations supporting her, including the United States and the United Kingdom, have signed up to these agreements, and the neglect to enforce them is criminal." Mr Deputy Speaker, journalists too have paid a heavy price to bring us reports of events on the ground. At least 126 journalists have been killed in Gaza since October the 7th, with many others being arrested. The presence of journalists in Gaza is essential in order that the world be kept informed of the horrific events which are taking place, and in due course to hold those responsible to account. Mr Deputy Speaker, the United States and the United Kingdom has much more work to do in this respect of challenging all participants in this conflict and to respect the human rights of civilians, including humanitarian aid workers, health workers and journalists. Without these humanitarian aid and health workers, many more lives would be lost, and without the work of the journalists, the world would be far less well informed of the horrors that are taking place in Gaza. Mr. Deputy Speaker, in the last week, 27 humanitarian and human rights agencies, including Christian Aid UK, Oxfam, Muslim Aid, wrote an open letter to the Prime Minister calling for an immediate and permanent ceasefire, a suspension of all arms exports, and for the UK to ensure Israel fully implements international courts of justice orders. In conclusion, any continuation of the military operation in Gaza merely results in innocent men, women and children paying the price for a crime they did not commit. The only way to prevent further loss of civilian lives is to secure release of hostages, and the entry of life-saving humanitarian is to secure an immediate and permanent ceasefire, including calling off the Rafah offensive. Not tomorrow, not next week, not next month, today. In conclusion, Mr. Speaker, I fully support international bans for an immediate and permanent ceasefire in Gaza, and will be voting in favour of the SNP motion today.
Martin Docherty-Hughes.
A bit sooner than I expected, Mr. Deputy Speaker, but thank you. Interestingly enough, Mr. Deputy Speaker, I rose in the House on Monday and quoted a former member of the House, indeed a former member for Dundee and a former Prime Minister, and the same proposition I would lay before the Prime Minister if they were here, and indeed the leader of the British Labour Party, regarding what I think is their delayed response to this cataclysmic genocide being rained upon the Palestinian people. Their British policy to Palestine has indeed, in that quote, been weighed in a balance and found wanting. How else can our constituents, indeed the people of Scotland, view the British Parliament when its political class has, since November, the last time we dragged it to debate this subject, actually view them as they have deflected the reality on the ground in Gaza? Now, since November, Mr. Deputy Speaker, I would like to know at the end of this debate, when the Minister sums up, what assurances did the Prime Minister, and indeed any other ministers or shadow ministers from the loyal opposition, receive from the government of Benjamin Netanyahu regarding the systematic targeting of civilians and civilian infrastructure? Has there, I have to say, seemed pious interventions in any way restrained the government of Israel from the policy of genocide, all the while enabling the death cult? And I have to agree with the Right Honourable Lady across who just spoke, the death cult of Hamas, indeed making it a partner in death, hate and crime. How does this British political class find itself in this devilish and ominous situation? Now, 153 nations have concluded that the immediate ceasefire is necessary to bring an end to the utter devastation in Gaza and seek a way forward to deal with that death cult of Hamas, which is supported by, as we know, the theocrats of Iran. And I must remind the House it was a regime to which the British government has pledged to pay £400 million to in regards to an outstanding debt. So it is complicated. But the Chamber needs to discuss this as I see the government pirouetting on the head of a pin. For how is it that the French Republic has called for an immediate ceasefire? How is it that NATO allies like the Kingdom of Spain and also the Kingdom of the Netherlands have not only called for a ceasefire, but have even stopped sending arms to Israel? How have they come to conclude that which this Parliament and its political class cannot? 153 nations, Mr. Deputy Speaker, with the British political class led by the British Prime Minister and the leader of His Majesty's loyal opposition. One asks, opposition to what? Now, I have to say, Mr. Deputy Speaker, that the State of Israel has been acting, the way it has been acting must be challenged. We cannot sidestep the issues faced by the Palestinian nation. I think I've spoken to one of the speakers from the Liberal Democrats. Its survival, and indeed the State of Israel's survival, depends on it. This is a generational injustice that the Palestinian people have endured. And what is the answer? I know the answer. It's an immediate ceasefire. The Prime Minister of Israel's strategy is to actually isolate the Palestinians in Gaza from the Palestinians in the West Bank. And let's remind ourselves, he is a Prime Minister who's already tarnished not only with a wicked policy in Gaza, but mired in allegations of corruption In his cabinet's a minister who is a convicted terrorist and another minister who is a confessed fascist. We must be mindful, Mr Deputy Speaker, that in seeking peace we require justice, and that peace, as others have said, must be founded in truth, built according to justice, vivified and integrated by charity, and put into practice in freedom. I'm sure, Mr Deputy Speaker, freedom desired by Palestinians and Israelis alike.
Anum Qaisar.
Thank you, Mr Deputy Speaker. The Right Honourable Member for Northampton North began his contribution by telling Jewish people watching that they have friends in this chamber. I wish to reiterate that in the strongest possible of terms. Jewish people are not the Israeli government and Muslims are not Hamas. In a matter of weeks, Muslims across the world will fast from sunrise to sunset during the holy month of Ramadan. It's time to take life at a slower pace. That, however, is far from the reality for people in Gaza. They live with hospitals bombed, homes bombed, ambulances bombed, churches bombed, mosques bombed, UN schools bombed, refugee camps bombed, factories bombed, and the bombing continues. Gaza is under siege from the air, and the F-35 stealth bomber, often referred to as the most lethal fighter jet in the world, is being used. Parts for this fighter jet, the laser targeting system and the weapons release system, are made in British factories, which means that we simply do not know if those weapons are being used by Israeli authorities in the massacre of families and children in Gaza. Politics is all about choices. The UK government has the choice to stop or suspend arms export licences to Israel, and there's precedent for this. In 2014, the current Foreign Secretary, who was the then Prime Minister, suspended 12 arms export licences in light of evidence of human rights abuse. It is morally corrupt, outrageous, and sickens me to my core that the UK continues to sell arms to Israel. To the people of Gaza, the mothers, fathers, husbands, wives, sons, daughters, to you all, I'm sorry. I'm sorry that this institution of Westminster has seen your tears, yet ignored your pain and suffering. I'm sorry that your hopes of returning to the beach to play in the clear blue sea have been snatched away from you. I'm sorry that children are experiencing heart attacks and will live a life full of trauma. I'm sorry that your dreams and aspirations have changed from becoming scientists and footballers to dreams and aspirations of staying alive and accessing clean drinking water. I'm sorry. In their hundreds of thousands, the public have marched on the streets, a unified mass movement standing up against the status quo. People from different and no faith, men and women, adults and children, rich and poor, saying enough is enough, demanding a ceasefire. Here in Westminster, we may have the whip system and direction from party leadership, but every politician is accountable for their own actions. It does not matter that this debate was tabled by the SNP, who have third-party status. It doesn't matter if this vote isn't binding. These are semantics. We cannot continue to accept the systemic and deliberate oppression of the Palestinian people. There must be an immediate ceasefire. I'll give way.
I'm very grateful. In terms of the semantics, would you agree that we must remind ourselves of the quote from Benjamin Netanyahu in 2019 when he stated, when it comes to Hamas, for example, he knows that as long as Hamas remains in Gaza, he can always argue there is no partner for peace during our lifetime. He's part of the cause of this situation.
I completely agree with my honourable friend, and I thank him for his intervention. Britain, of course, has a moral responsibility towards the wider Middle East region for the scars of the British Empire, the Iraq War, and the incompetence of successive governments which have promised peace yet failed to deliver. When we look back to this period of history, we'll surely be asked, and we'll ask ourselves, what did you do when Gaza was being relentlessly bombed? Yet here we are in the House of Commons with members of Parliament playing time-wasting games and abandoning international law. Why?
Stephen Crabb. Order. Before I call Carol Monaghan, after her, the next speaker, which will be Sir Edward Lee, will be down to 3 minutes. Carol Monaghan.
Thank you, Mr Deputy Speaker. The recent ICJ ruling means that the UK, as a signatory to the Genocide Convention, is legally obliged to take measures in the face of Israel's failure to prevent acts which may be found to amount to a genocide. I've been contacted by many constituents on this issue, asking for me to support a ceasefire. But I want to read you the email of one constituent. She contacted me and I spoke to her yesterday by phone, but I'll read you her email. I'm writing to you again as a Jewish constituent, urging you to join your fellow MPs in calling for an immediate ceasefire in Gaza. I, like many in my community, have been utterly shaken by these months of violence. As I write, over 28,000 Palestinians have been killed, 12,000 of them children, and over 1.9 million displaced. Jews in the UK have been in a collective state of shock and distress since the atrocities committed by Hamas on October the 7th. Many in my community lost family and friends in the attack. Yet this only strengthens my resolve to end the utterly heartbreaking violence Israel is unleashing against the Palestinian civilians in Gaza. This is not a war. I pray for the safety of both Palestinians in Gaza and the hostages in captivity. But only a ceasefire can provide the relief they desperately need. Lives, livelihoods and families are being destroyed. The very fabric of Palestinian society in Gaza is being upended. Such a policy of revenge and collective punishment achieves safety for nobody. The UK government is responsible for ensuring international law is adhered to. Yet every moment it fails to advance a ceasefire, it is complicit in the perpetration of war crimes and the killing of civilians. The ongoing escalation of violence in Rafah risks further mass atrocities. This cannot go on. As a Jewish constituent, I thank you. I thank the First Minister and the SNP for your actions so far in working towards a ceasefire, the return of the surviving hostages and a lasting peace. I urge you, my MP, and my government to demand an immediate ceasefire, the safe return of hostages and the urgent provision of substantial life-saving aid to Palestinians in Gaza. This is quite simply the only way we can end this violence and start to fight for a future that guarantees freedom, equality and dignity for all Palestinians and Israelis.
John Nicolson.
How to find words in my allotted 3 minutes, Mr Deputy Speaker, for the tragedy which has engulfed the Palestinian people. Israeli bombs have killed 30,000, more than 10,000 children have died. The death toll per head of population is greater than any conflict since the Second World War. Gaza lies in ruins. People are starving. Women are enduring caesareans without anaesthetics. And yet this House has been paralysed. I vividly remember as a journalist in Palestinian refugee camps, Palestinians would come up to show me the keys to lost homes. Their families were forced to flee in what is now Israel, when advancing guerrilla troops spread terror. And they would also, along with their old-fashioned keys, show me British Palestine mandate house deeds issued by us, guaranteed by the United Kingdom and stamped with the mark of the Crown. We owe them. At the very least, we owe them our voices raised in outrage at the collective punishment they are now enduring in defiance of international law. Innocent people, children, babies, not remotely responsible for the atrocities carried out by evil Hamas, slaughtering indiscriminately the innocent for the crimes of the guilty. That's the very definition of collective punishment. So what's the point, some say? We know we can't force Netanyahu to stop bombing, but the point is that we can apply pressure. Silence is tacit acceptance of Israel's actions. We can show Palestinians who still imagine that this House is a moral compass that we do care passionately about their plight. We lament their suffering, and we despair at the lost innocence of their children as another generation learns to associate Israel with cruelty, extremism and hate. Now, the vote at Westminster tonight, the second we on these benches have called, is not and never was, as some commentators parochially claimed, about embarrassing political opponents. Not everything is about Britain. Now, I won't speak for my colleagues cross-party, though I know many out with the SNP support our motion. Some have lost their front-bench jobs because they can't in good conscience remain silent. I hope the majority of Westminster MPs now feel the same. Embarrassed silence will not save lives. If we don't call for an immediate ceasefire now, when will we call for an immediate ceasefire? How many more innocents have to die? No. It's past time for our voices to be heard loudly and unambiguously. Enough bombing, enough slaughter.
Andrew Gwynne.
Thank you, Mr Deputy Speaker. We sometimes rattle off statistics in this place and they have no real meaning. But what we do know is that in this dreadful conflict there are 1,200 innocent Israelis that were brutally and evilly murdered, beheaded, raped, kidnapped on the 7th of October. And the consequence of that has been the unfolding of utterly horrific images across the Gaza Strip, with almost 30,000 people, men, women, children, innocent citizens, also tragically killed in this brutal conflict. I will be voting for an immediate ceasefire tonight because the fighting needs to stop, and it needs to stop now. But I will be doing so on the basis of the motion amendment that was set out so eloquently by my right honourable friend, the Shadow Foreign Secretary. Because words matter. And it matters that we call for a ceasefire, not a unilateral ceasefire, but a ceasefire of both sides. Otherwise, it's not a ceasefire. And they can laugh. But if Hamas do not lay down their arms too, it is not a ceasefire. Those are simple facts. I want to make sure that the offensive on Rafah does not happen, that we get aid into the Gaza Strip in the quantities that we want to see. Aid wasn't mentioned in the SNP motion. That the ICJ provisional rulings are implemented and upheld because international law matters. That we get a two-state solution and a peace process. That we tackle the wrongdoings in the West Bank. The illegal settlements have to end. But we also need to make sure that there is justice for the Palestinians and we get that Palestinian state. None of that was in the SNP motion. Now, I will give way.
There's no water or oxygen in the SNP motion. Does he presume, therefore, they don't want water or oxygen? Don't be so silly, man. You know exactly what this is about. This is about stopping the killing now.
Yeah, we know exactly what it's about, and he's playing party political football. He's playing party political football with the most atrocious situation that's going on in the Middle East. As the Honourable Member for Foyle rightly said earlier, there is a lot more that brings people together in this place. We want to see a ceasefire. We want to see an end to the killing.
Point of order. Playing party politics. I'm not in a political party. He should know that.
That's not a point of order for the Chair. That's part of the argument. Gavin Newlands.
Thank you very much, Mr Deputy Speaker. In the short time available to me, I'd like to discuss the value of a Palestinian life and why that for some in this place that seems to be less than a Ukrainian life or an Israeli life. Yeah. We all watched in horror as the October 7th atrocity unfolded. You will find no one in this place not disgusted, sickened by the act of evil perpetrated that day. Similarly, we all watched on horrified as Putin's forces invaded Ukraine and carried out unspeakable acts. We spoke as one in our complete condemnation of these acts. This is where the indefensible double standards begin. The Government and Labour front benches were able to talk about near genocide and war crimes in Ukraine, yet are unable to do so now in Gaza. In that short time, I want to tell the stories of just two families and the tragedy that has befell them, war crimes. The Associated Press reported the sound of gunfire crackled over the phone as the teenage girl hid in the car and spoke. An Israeli tank was near the vehicle as she and her family were trying to heed Israel's call to evacuate their home in Gaza. Israeli troops were firing on the car. 15-year-old Leanne said in terrified calls to relatives and emergency services, "Everyone in the vehicle was killed except her and her 5-year-old female cousin Hind," she said. "They are shooting at us. The tank is next to me." And then there was a burst of gunfire. She screamed and fell silent. The Palestinian Red Crescent sent an ambulance but lost contact with the crew, and 12 days later that ambulance was discovered, blackened and destroyed, the two medics dead. Red Crescent accused Israeli forces of targeting the ambulance as it pulled up near the family's vehicle. They said it had coordinated the journey with Israeli forces just as they had in the past. The family car was found with 6 bodies, including Leanne's and Hind's. 15-year-old Nahid Barbach had been waving a white flag in Gaza when he was shot dead, all witnessed by his 9-year-old sister, Rimas, who told ITV News they fired and hit him in the leg and he fell. My father kept telling him to crawl back towards us, then they hit him in the neck and back. My brother Ramez wanted to go to him. My father grabbed him, but he got free and ran towards Nahid. He tried to pull him, but then he too was hit in his heart and fell on his brother. He looked at us with a smile and passed away. She added that she couldn't sleep because she cries her eyes out every time she thinks of her brothers. Her father said, "They used loudspeakers to tell us to evacuate. When they did, they killed my sons before my very eyes. Nowhere is safe in Gaza, even when the IDF promises it to be so. It's IDF state-sponsored barbarism." Yes, OK.
I'm grateful to my honourable friend giving way. Does he agree that if you're in Gaza at the moment and you're watching your daughter having a C-section on a tarpaulin without anaesthetic, or you're picking up parts of your brother from around the neighbourhood, or indeed you're burying a child, you're worried about the wording of a motion? They want to see a ceasefire to stop all that now. And whatever happens tonight, does he agree that we should be voting as a House for a ceasefire? And on our motion or the Labour motion, we should be voting for a ceasefire. That's what is needed.
Absolutely.
I couldn't agree more, Mr Speaker, and that's what made some of the nonsense earlier on even more shameful. And it doesn't do this House any justice whatsoever, and some people need to reflect on their actions this day. But all of this, Mr Deputy Speaker, carried out with the Government and Labour front benches collectively covered its eyes, put its fingers in its ears and pretended not to see and hear what the rest of us cannot unsee. I asked at the start what the value of a Palestinian life was, and quite honest, that's a question that should haunt the Prime Minister and the Leader of the Opposition. But I can tell them that 24 Palestinians have been killed for every Israeli killed on October the 7th, and that number is going up every single day that we sit here and do nothing.
Mayhew. Ian Paisley.
Thank you very much, Mr Deputy Speaker. On the 13th of November, I had the honour of meeting Ver Efrat and her daughter Adi Efrat, a mother and daughter kidnapped by Hamas on the 7th of October. They were rescued, thankfully, by brave IDF soldiers. For the last number of weeks, I've stood in Parliament Square holding posters containing the names of people like Zaki Abraham, Rafi Gaval, Imber Halman and others who are kidnapped. Just not Israelis, but people from around the world who remain kidnapped today by Hamas, tortured today by Hamas and its instigator, Muslim Brotherhood. All of this is a consequence. The awful war that we're witnessing in Gaza is a consequence also. It's a consequence of the unjustifiable attack upon Israelis and Jewish people on the 7th of October. An attack that the Right Honourable Member who has just spoken quite rightly identified is not even mentioned in the motion that we are being asked to vote upon today. We're not being asked to vote for the comments from the member for Argyll and Bute, no matter how sincere or mealy-mouthed they may have been. We are being asked to vote for a motion that does not contain any word about the rape of the woman, the murder of the children, the unjustifiable attack. It's as if, Mr. Deputy Speaker, it didn't happen. It's as if it was invisible. It's as if, like other people in the 20th century, denied things that happened to Israel and to Jewish people. That's essentially what we're seeing tonight, the denial of an attack on Israel. The tragedy, yes, it is utterly vile that it did not appear. Yes, of course I'll give way.
Very grateful to him for giving... I'm sorry, did he say he was giving way to a different honourable member?
No.
Yeah, I'm very grateful for him giving way, and I think that we've all heard much today about what various motions contain and don't contain. Let's focus on the situation and what we all agree on. We all in this House, as he well knows, condemn the despicable behaviour of Hamas. We all call for the release of the hostages. Their poor families must be in absolutely terrible situations. We all want people to stop being killed, women and children particularly. But I say to the honourable gentleman that the remarks he just made, where he was conflating things which should never be conflated, do not show this House in the best way. We're all entitled to our views, but on this particular subject, we need to treat this seriously and with the dignity and respect it deserves. And I'm sorry to tell the honourable gentleman, he did not do that.
Well, I am sorry that the honourable lady's motion, which she is asking me and members to vote on tonight, does not contain a single word about the 7th of October. It is a denial and it is invisible because it's as if it didn't happen. That is what we're being asked to vote on tonight by them. The tragedy of the thousands of Palestinian civilians and casualties in Gaza is the moral responsibility of Hamas, just as the Israeli casualties are the moral responsibility and actual responsibility of Hamas, who have deliberately and cynically initiated a high-intensity conflict in one of the most densely populated areas on earth, specifically to maximise civilian deaths and to turn global opinion against Israel. Today, Israel faces attacks on 8 fronts: on Gaza, Iraq, Lebanon, Syria, the West Bank, Yemen and Iran. And the member who spoke on behalf of the SNP today wants us to open up another front. That's the parliamentary front against Israel, and wants us to oppose them from this place. They fear to recognise that this House can be pro-peace, pro-ceasefire, but also recognise Israel's right to exist. And it's a shame that the SNP could not do that tonight.
Thank you, Mr. Deputy Speaker.
Thank you very much. I hope you can direct me. I've just been called anti-Semite by the honourable member from the north of Ireland. I think it's an absolute disgrace that is where he is bringing this debate to today, Mr. Speaker.
Hear, hear.
Mr. Speaker has pointed out time and time again that we must use temperate language, particularly in debates which are very heated. And so I would ask members to be very careful. I didn't hear what was said, but I must reinforce. Please use temperate language, whether you're on your feet or whether you're sitting down yelling something. I prefer you not to yell anything, but please use temperate language.
Steven Bonnar.
Mr. Deputy Speaker, for too long the leaders of the Western world, including in this very chamber and those who populated these benches before us, have turned a blind eye to the decades-long suffering of the Palestinian people, a blind eye to the occupation of their lands, a blind eye to the expansion of illegal settlements, a blind eye to the theft of their homes. We are and have been complicit in the continued futility of their struggle for self-determination and complicit in their
pain and their suffering. Arms sales to Israel from this place, which we are then used to murder innocent women and children in Palestine, make us so complicit. Ministers will stand at that dispatch box time after time and attempt to justify those arms sales and those deaths. Mr Deputy Speaker, since October 7 and the deplorable actions of that day, which have been, by my party, universally condemned, we have been asked to do more than turn a blind eye to the collective punishment of innocent Palestinians. We have been asked to endorse it. And if it isn't collective punishment, then what is it? Is it merely a conflict? Is it a war? Or is it more than that? Is it genocide? And if it is, are we truly prepared to keep turning a blind eye? Because we on these benches say no longer. 30,000 Palestinians lie dead. 12,000 of that number are innocent children. 60,000 more have been injured, their lives forever altered by the horrors of war. We say no more.
Would the honourable gentleman give way?
Be happy to.
I thank the honourable gentleman for giving way. Does he agree with me that the focus today must be on the bloodshed and slaughter in both Israel and Gaza, and some of the antics and games and name-calling we've seen today in this chamber paints this chamber in a very unedifying light?
Yeah. I couldn't agree more with my honourable friend. She is absolutely on the money. We cannot afford to sugarcoat the truth of the harsh realities that are being faced on the ground in Israel and in Gaza and in the occupied Palestinian territories. All the potential for further atrocities in Rafah. 2/3 of those who are dead are women and children. Is this just another conflict? Does that seem to be proportionate? No, I won't. And no, it is not proportionate. We are being asked to turn a blind eye to genocide, Mr Deputy Speaker. And it is high time that the world recognised it as such. Genocide. Genocide. That is what is happening in Israel and Palestine. Innocent lives are being wiped out, families are being ripped apart, communities are being decimated, never to return before our very eyes. The concern and the anguish both our Muslim and our Jewish communities here in the UK are experiencing must be intolerable. Watching the lives and the potential of their countrymen and women being destroyed by the senseless and horrific violence that is being meted out upon them. Their anguish is our anguish. Their struggle is our struggle. And their fight for justice and peace is our fight for justice and peace. The world is watching. We need an immediate ceasefire now. The SNP motion before us gives this House an opportunity to tell the world what kind of people we are, what kind of world we wish to live in, what kind of parliament is this. For all those who believe in the inherent dignity and the worth of every human life, then I urge you, stand with me, stand with us, support our motion by voting for an immediate ceasefire in Gaza today. Thank you.
Allan Brown.
Thank you, Mr Deputy Speaker. This call for an immediate ceasefire is about limiting the slaughter to the horrific 30,000 civilians already killed, stopping more civilians being killed by bombs, by bullets, starving to death or dying from disease. Now, currently 1 in 6 children in the north of Gaza under the age of 2 are suffering from malnutrition. 90% of children across Gaza under the age of 5 are already affected by 1 or more infectious disease. Now, aid is available. No aid is available, but it's blocked from getting into Gaza by Israel, which breaches the interim ICJ ruling. If denial of electricity, denial of food, denial of water, denial of medicine isn't collective punishment, then what is it? And he's called out for what it is, and that's where Labour and Tories need to look at that. The 2 million displaced citizens 2 million citizens displaced with instructions of the occupying power breaches international law by violating Article 49 of the Geneva Convention. So where is the Government or Labour condemnation of the displacement of civilians? Now, in terms of reprisals, obviously the Hamas attacks were brutal, but 25 innocent Palestinian civilian deaths for every Israeli death is not justice. Now, the ICJ is going to make a judgment on genocide, but when the Israeli ambassador to the UK stated Every school, every mosque, every second house has access to tunnels, and asked Ian Dale on live UK air if there's any other solution other than destroying every building in Gaza, then she's justifying genocide in terms of physical destruction and breach of Article 2 of the Convention on Genocide. Where is the condemnation of the comments by the Israeli ambassador to the UK? It's a deathly silence. Now, rightly, when debating the merits of a ceasefire, the issue of the release of hostages comes up. It's quite clear a ceasefire is required if there's going to be any chance of them being released safely. It's obvious that unless there's a ceasefire, then the hostages are also at risk of death from disease and starvation, or even killed by the IDF, who have already unfortunately killed some of their own brethren. So perhaps it's time to listen to the brave families of the hostages who have actually been protesting against Netanyahu, who is calling for a different approach. It's time to listen to organisations like Jews for Justice, to the 25 humanitarian organisations demanding an immediate ceasefire. It's horrific to hear that humanitarian aid workers are also dying right now before us. It really is time to have a ceasefire and then to look at building the two-state solution and helping the survivors who are going to be traumatised for life.
In fewer than 3 minutes, you'll be helping your other colleagues. Angus, Brendan, MacNeil. Mr. Speaker, the speakers on the government side, so if people can do their contribution, say what they need to say in fewer than 3 minutes, you'll be helping your other colleagues. Angus, Brendan, MacNeil.
Mr. Speaker, I'll endeavour to do that. I think we all abhor the deaths of the 7th of October by Hamas, and we all should. Particularly, there was Israeli peace activists, and I can hazard a guess, perhaps wrongly, but I don't think so, what they would have wanted. It's certainly not what's unfolded. The deaths of the 7th of October, or the death of the 6th of October, or whenever before or since, are all very sad and very lamentable. In August 2023, Mr. Speaker, the UN had noted that 172 people had been killed in the West Bank alone by Israeli forces, not Gaza, but the West Bank. And why did the UN report that figure in August? Well, it would pass the grisly milestone of 170 killed in the West Bank in the entirety of 2022. But it's unfortunate and it's really lamentable. This has been going on too long. It's sad this has been going on too long. And the killing by Israel of 25 more than Hamas killed in October the 7th is a very grisly and sad fact, especially as 30,000 of those dead are in the majority children and women. There can be no room for hate, Mr. Speaker, Mr. Deputy Speaker, and we all condemn anti-Semitism for fear of where it can lead and has led in the past. But we can see daily on the television where anti-Palestinianism has led, and this has led to genocide. The Labour motion today supports efforts to achieve a lasting ceasefire, not a call for a ceasefire, but efforts to achieve. The Tory motion talks of moves towards a permanent, sustainable ceasefire. The main motion of the day talks of a ceasefire, meaning that this has to stop. And what's in the motion or not in the motion is beside the point. The motion is not a history motion, it is a ceasefire motion to stop killing people. And if I would be critical of the SNP, I would just say to them one thing, and I'm not in the SNP, that efforts to have any sort of relationship with the Labour leader have not worked well and don't bode well for after any election when they hope to get a referendum. But that is beside the point. The House here can't impose a ceasefire, but it can be a very important domino towards that ceasefire. It can be good for the immediate lives saved, and it can mean a safer future for Israel itself in the long term. The alternative to a ceasefire is to continue fire. It means hundreds and thousands, and maybe tens of thousands more people die. No more, Mr. Speaker, no more.
Amy Callaghan.
Thank you, Mr. Deputy Speaker. The situation in Gaza is beyond horrific. Around 1.5 million people have been squeezed into the city of Rafah. They have fled there being told by the Israeli government it was a safe zone. They fled believing they were escaping the horrors of bombing, but that is not the case. We've all seen the videos and heard the stories of the horrors coming out of Gaza. We've seen the stories of kids being forced to have their limbs amputated without anaesthetic. We've seen the stories of women being forced to use scraps of cloth from tents as sanitary products. We've seen the stories of journalists killed whilst trying to document the Israeli government's atrocities so the world can see. And indeed, just recently, Mr Deputy Speaker, we heard the tragic story of 6-year-old Hind Rajab. Because of a conflict that was not of her making, and because of this government's unwillingness to take meaningful and effective action, because of this place's unwillingness to take meaningful and effective action, Hind has become yet another casualty of the Israeli government's vendetta in Gaza, a 6-year-old casualty. Let history remember them. Let history remember what we do here tonight. So it's but a simple fact that the best way, the only way to guarantee not only the safety of the Palestinian population in Gaza, but also the release of all the remaining hostages is through an immediate ceasefire, not through continuously bombing a civilian population, not through continuously moving the people of Gaza from one area to another, and certainly not by assaulting the last remaining safe zone in Gaza. It is time for us all to show moral courage and recognise that the only way to bring an end to the suffering is by voting for an immediate ceasefire. Mr Deputy Speaker, we've seen injured Palestinians forced to travel south on foot as there was no ambulances available, and thought, surely now they have to back a ceasefire. We saw a pregnant woman burned to death and thought, surely now they have to back a ceasefire. We saw hospitals and safe routes bombed and thought, surely now they have to back a ceasefire. We saw premature babies dying in incubators and thought, surely now they have to back a ceasefire. We saw white phosphorus falling from the sky and thought, surely now they have to back a ceasefire. Now we are seeing the death toll of almost 30,000 civilians killed, most of whom are women and children. Surely now, tonight, they all have to back a ceasefire.
Sure. Thank you, Mr Deputy Speaker, and thank you very much for giving way. We need to recognise the gendered face of conflict, as the honourable member has said. Hamas has weaponised sexual violence against female civilians in Israel. And UN experts warned on Monday that the IDF may have killed Palestinian women and girls who were holding white flags. Will the honourable member agree that we need an immediate bilateral ceasefire?
I agree with the honourable member that we absolutely need a ceasefire, and we need a ceasefire now, so I hope she joins me in voting for the SNP motion this evening. Mr Deputy Speaker, people across these aisles, including many of my constituents in Eastern Bartonshire, demand through marches, through rallies, through petitions and through emails that the UK Government back a ceasefire. We must end the suffering, we must stop this humanitarian tragedy, we must have a ceasefire now.
Thank you very much. Dave Doogan. Mr Deputy Speaker, 23% of my casework since October has been on this humanitarian disaster in Israel and in Gaza. The vast majority of my constituents seeking a ceasefire and to see the death and destruction of communities, the intolerable, unimaginable misery of innocent civilians brought to an end. And also Angus constituents highlighting Israel's right to defend itself and highlighting the plight of the people who were slaughtered by the murderous criminal terrorists that are the members of Hamas in their appalling attacks on October the 7th. And I have unity with all of my constituents in their varying ambitions, because this situation in Gaza is a disaster for everybody. No one more so than the innocent civilians within Gaza itself, but also for the people of Israel. And I refuse to believe that we have some sort of moral superiority in this country when we call for a ceasefire. I also believe there are people, good people within Israel, desperately sad at what's happening to innocent people in Gaza. And that's why we need to give voice to them as well within this Parliament, within this state, to let them see that we have their ambitions on our tongues as well. Yes, I'm giving way.
My apologies, Mr Deputy Speaker. I thank the honourable member for giving way. Has he been struck, and I'm sure he has in the way that I have, by the extraordinary number of decent, ordinary people, constituents, who wouldn't normally get in touch with their MP, getting in touch on this particular issue?
Well done, Jamie.
Well, yes, I am, Mr Deputy Speaker, and that's why it's a great sadness that it's taken quite so long for this Parliament to give such an in-depth debate to this global issue of utter catastrophe, and I'm very pleased that my colleagues in the SNP have brought this Opposition Day motion today, and I'm very pleased also to demonstrate that it wouldn't be such an important debate were it not for all the people on both sides of the House coming and giving voice to their constituents' anguish over what is an utter disaster zone. 30,000 civilians dead, a stain, Mr Deputy Speaker, on all our conscience. Civilians who played no part in the atrocities of the 7th of October. No, I'm going to make progress. Too many people needing in, and approaching 5 months of intolerable incarceration for those that were taken hostage on the 7th of October, and trying to extract the remains of your family from the rubble does not bear contemplation. I think you know you're in difficult territory if you're the State of Israel, Mr Deputy Speaker, if the United States of America is telling you you've gone over the top. And so I think the sort of semantics in this chamber today is much to be regretted. And what type of ceasefire is an indulgence that people who are not living in fear of their lives are able to indulge in? A ceasefire is a self-explanatory, simple term which the people of Gaza would very much like us to get to grips with and move in one motion or one amendment today, so that the people of the United Kingdom can have their voice heard on this issue. One of the troubling issues in closing, Mr Deputy Speaker, is the false equivalence that pervades through this debate. There is a false equivalence that 30,000 civilian deaths in Gaza is somehow going to atone for the tragedy that befell Israeli civilians. It's not. And the IDF represent a democratically elected government in the State of Israel and the people of Israel. Hamas do not represent the people of Gaza. That is a completely false equivalence. And what is most important in all of this, Mr Deputy Speaker, is that humanity must prevail, whatever the detail. And that's why I'll be supporting the SNP's motion.
Perkins. Thank you, Mr Deputy Speaker. This is a really important day for all of us in this House, representing our constituents that have written to us in droves, asking us to speak out for a humanitarian end to the crisis. And I want to reflect on some of the speeches we've heard from right across the House, and in particular from the member for Gillingham and Rainham. If not now, when? And that's a question that we should all be asking ourselves. We're very good as a chamber when we come and we reflect on the horrors of the genocide. We think about what happened in Srebrenica. We think about what happened in Rwanda and Darfur. And we ask ourselves the question, why didn't we stop those? Why didn't we stop the killing in those situations? Yet, Mr Deputy Speaker, here we are again. 29,000 people, women and children, murdered. And why? And why? And we are members of the Security Council. We are in a position of leadership. We should be standing up today. And yes, we extend the hand of friendship to our allies in Israel, but we say that the only way that we can resolve this is if we have an end to the fighting now. And we recognise that everything that we've talked about over many decades about that two-state solution, that we now have to push on. We are politicians. We are diplomats. We are meant to improve people's lives. We have come together, thankfully, to support our friends in Ukraine, the House coming together, that Putin must be defeated. But we need to recognise we can't have any more of the needless slaughter taking place in Gaza. Yes, we want to see Israelis being able to live in peace and security. Yes, of course, we want the removal of Hamas, that vile terrorist organisation. But for goodness sake, colleagues, today is the day that we must come together. Let's stand united. Let's say no more should innocent civilians lose their lives in Gaza. Let's make sure today is one that this House can be proud of.
Neale Hanvey.
Thank you, Mr Deputy Speaker. Today, my boys celebrate their 18th birthday, and so for me, This is a special moment in that I hope that we will come to a decision that will make the world that they step into as adults a better place. And I would have hoped that one of the most serious humanitarian crises in living memory would have brought consensus instead of competition. We're supposed to be voting to bring peace to a deeply polarised conflict, but that won't be achieved by political factionalism in this place. And despite accusations of tribalism in the Scottish independence movement, ALBA intend, and as often we have done before, to support the SNP's motion today. My party's position from the 9th of October was set out by my party leader Alex Salmond, and it is that there has been a long and sorry catalogue of atrocities throughout the history of this conflict. Terrorist action against civilians can never be justified, and neither can military action in reprisal leading to the killing and maiming of children. Both sides should be told by the international community to now choose the path of de-escalation and ceasefire. There can be no lasting settlement which ignores long-standing UN resolutions, and there is no path to peace which can be initiated by violence against civilians. He was right, and as has been evidenced by subsequent violence, death and destruction. This serves no one, and an end to bloodshed should be the only guiding principle we observe. At the start of the current conflict, many of us met with a young Israeli man who lost both of his peace-campaigning parents in the October the 7th attack. Despite his loss, his appeal was for de-escalation and peace, and the amplification of moderate voices within Israel. He described the anger in his country towards the current Israeli government. We have also heard from Palestinian representatives who have lost every generation of their family in the ensuing IDF attacks. Families who followed the instruction from Israel to move to the south of Gaza, but were wiped out anyway. We've heard testimony from Human Rights Watch and Reporters Without Borders, who are witnesses to alleged war crimes. The ICJ have found it plausible that Israel's act may amount to genocide. The Jewish Voice for Peace of the Jewish Voice for Peace Rabbinical Council have condemned the continuing violence against Palestinians and those countries who support and enable it. If this House can't cooperate and calls those of us who seek peace naive on a matter of such humanitarian significance, how can we expect others so invested in this conflict to lay down their arms and talk?
Kenny MacAskill.
Thank you, Mr Deputy Speaker. Obviously, Israel is entitled to defend itself. It's unquestionable that the actions of Hamas were totally reprehensible. But we have long passed the position in which Israeli action is legitimate. It's not been a matter of days or weeks. It is now months. They have gone on beyond what international law views as acceptable. And now what they're doing is not a natural consequence of what Hamas did, which was evil and wicked, and the retention of the prisoners and holding hostages remains that way. What has remained is not by consequence, it is deliberate. Israel is acting to a plan which is to make Gaza unlivable. That has been a plan of Netanyahu and others. It is for that basis that we have to support a ceasefire. It is on that basis that the actions of Israel have to be called out, because they are not simply defending their own. They are not simply looking for hostages in tunnels. What they are doing is crushing the lifeblood out of Gaza so that it will be unlivable, not for weeks or months, but for years, if not forever. It is their intention to flatten it, and that is why we have to require not just an immediate ceasefire, but we ultimately have to have a genuine peace. That comes back to the role of Britain, which has been supine towards Israel and towards the United States. And the tragedy now, it is moving from being supine in failing to vote at the United Nations to being complicit. We do know that RAF Artillery is not simply being used by the RAF to fly into Israel, but we've handed it over to the United States so that they can move things into Israel. Of course, when we ask the UK government, what is America moving from Cyprus into Israel, they can't answer. And of course, when you ask the Americans, they say, well, we can't tell you because it's a British base. It is a deliberate distortion to allow Israel to be supplied through the UK acting in complicity with the United States of America. We also know that intelligence is being used and carried out by Britain that is being shared with others. They say it's relating to the hostages, but what else do we know? We're simply not told. We do know that the British Army is training the IDF, and we know that the British military machine is actually seeing companies making huge profits. So the time has come for an immediate ceasefire, but the time has also come that the UK must stand up, stop being complicit with the United States, stop being supine to Israel, and stand up for humanity. The developing world is speaking out, and it's about time that the UK stood with them.
Gavel Roberts Stephens.
Mr Deputy Speaker, I have listened intently to those members who are supporting the government amendment, and they're asking us to ignore two key facts. They're asking us to ignore that the International Criminal Court investigation into war crimes and crimes against humanity by Israel, and they're asking us to ignore the order from the International Court of Justice, which urged the UK government to uphold their own legal obligations to prevent Israel from committing genocide. Difficult though it may seem for some, the act of voting today for immediate ceasefire is actually the simplest of actions required of members of this House. The harder task is finding an effective means of applying the pressure to do so. And we can start with halting the provision of arms to Israel, and we've already seen, the UK government already has the means to do this through Articles 6 and 7 of the Arms Trade Treaty, which the UK government has signed, and which bans sales where there is a concern that the arms may be used to breach international law. Mr Deputy Speaker, a YouGov poll in December showed that 71% of the UK public believe there should be an immediate ceasefire in Israel and Palestine, with only 12% against. The military escalation since then and the impending threat to Rafah could only have strengthened those views. As Oxfam have pointed out, over 100 countries, now including Canada, Australia and New Zealand, support an immediate ceasefire. And these numbers will grow, and we may find ourselves increasingly on the wrong side of history and humanity. Both the international community and our own individual constituents are aware of what's continuing to happen. Israel has intensified airstrikes in Rafah ahead of their threatened ground offensive. Remember that Rafah has 1.5 million people, including 500,000 children, all sheltering in 20% of the Gaza Strip without access to adequate shelter, water, food and medical facilities. That needs to stop, Mr Deputy Speaker. Mr Deputy Speaker, I'm blessed to represent a diverse constituency. And like so many others, I've had local organisations write to me, and I want to end with the words from the Crookston Community Group, who are represented by people of all faiths and none. In the midst of conflict and turmoil, the pursuit of peace becomes more crucial than ever. A ceasefire between Palestinians and Israelis is not just a regional issue, it's a call for humanity to come together and prioritise dialogue over violence. By embracing peace, we can pave the way for a brighter future for all mankind. And I ask all members to support the motion. Thank you.
Thank you. Order.
Michael Shanks.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. The list of babies killed in Gaza before their first birthday is beyond heartbreaking. And this week, there were at least 4 killed alone who hadn't even got to the stage where they had a name. And at the same time, footage emerged this week from Khan Yunis of Israeli hostage Shiri Bibas and her sons, aged 4 and 9 months old, still being held by Hamas. So when we debate this issue, we should keep in mind all those innocents caught up in this conflict, and this debate today has certainly not risen to that occasion at all times. The fighting must stop. We must have a ceasefire. I think there is now cross-party agreement. But I've heard many people say, both in this House today and outside it, that this situation isn't complex, that it's simple. vote for a ceasefire. It's symbolic. It's sending a message. It doesn't matter if you agree with every word of a motion. Just vote for it so you've voted for something. Think of the headline on BBC News, not the detail. How debased our politics has become that this is what now passes for foreign policy. Because words do matter. Detail is important. Not mentioning something in a motion matters. And that's why tonight I'll be voting for the Labour amendment in the name of the leader. Because it matters that we say what's important. We all know that the only way to get to the peaceful resolution that we need is the hard yards of diplomacy, and for both sides, Israel and Hamas, to agree to stop. I don't have any time. This conflict is raging far beyond this place, and the tone and the tenor of the debate matters. So in a week filled with politics, it's important tonight that we have the chance to vote for a ceasefire, and I think importantly more than that, that we spend time after this debate trying to build a consensus that was starting to emerge on the Conservative side for what this looks like going forward. Because if we want a ceasefire, we need a ceasefire, we have to build a consensus for it. Dividing this House isn't going to achieve that, and it's not going to save lives in Gaza.
SNP spokesperson Alison Thewliss.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker, and I want to thank the speakers that have come and raised their voices on behalf of the people of Gaza today. Madam Deputy Speaker, we are here today in condemnation of the atrocities committed against innocent people in Israel by Hamas on the 7th of October. We are here today in condemnation of the atrocities committed by Israel against innocent people in Gaza on every day since. We are here today in condemnation of the taking of hostages, of indiscriminate violence, of maiming, of the use of snipers, of the use of rape and sexual assault, of starvation, of attacks in places of worship, schools and hospital. It must stop. It must stop now. A pause is not enough. Filling the bellies of starving Wains one day just to bomb them the next is not acceptable. Pregnant women, those who have not miscarried or suffered stillbirth due to the unimaginable strain of living in a war zone, cannot time their labour from whenever that pause might fall. ActionAid have reported that Al-Adwa, the only functioning maternity hospital in northern Gaza, was hit 3 times in the past week. It is intolerable. Colleagues across this House have outlined the horrors in Gaza. Of Wee Rind Hijab, only 6, of the poet Rifat Al-Arir, of Dima Al-Haj, who lived in Glasgow, killed alongside her 6-month-old baby, her husband and 2 brothers. Dima was a health worker for the World Health Organisation. Dr Abdul Latif, a colleague of my honourable friend from Central Ayrshire, lost 50 members of his family, including children and grandchildren, when their home was bombed. The journalist, Wal Al-Dudi, lost his wife, daughter, 2 sons and other family members. I highlight these stories because when you get beyond the over 100 journalists, the 150 UN workers, the estimated 400 health workers, the 30,000 of our fellow human beings who have been killed, their stories become a cacophony of tragedy. It cannot be anything other than collective punishment, and as the International Court of Justice have found, a plausible risk of genocide being perpetrated by Israel. And more deaths will follow without a ceasefire, without allowing in a full flow of humanitarian aid, which Israel has been holding up. The Palestinian Red Crescent has seen their life-saving work disrupted by Israeli forces. There is a real fear for the people of now sheltering in Rafah, 1.4 million of them, if a further attack lands upon them. There are many ways to die in Gaza: disease, starvation, as well as by bombardment. And what of those who survive? The 1.9 million displaced, homeless, destitute, left among the rubble of their lives, orphaned, the 70,000 injured and suffering enduring trauma. We must not forget those people either. I have listened carefully to activists from the Gaza Families Reunited campaign who want to allow their families in the UK to reunite and bring families to sanctuary here. The UK has granted very few visas to Palestinians over the years, only 1,300 since 2014.
My honourable friend from Gilnorthis has previously talked about Dr Luba Hadouin. In Glasgow, my constituent Sama, Reem, who I listened to on a call yesterday, Grace Flankton and Alison Phipps, who are Palestinian friends, none of them have found a safe and legal route because none exists. People are fundraising to bribe their way out of Gaza for lack of a safe and legal route, all the time worrying about news of whether their relatives are dead or alive. There has been a scheme for Ukraine. Why is there yet no scheme for Gaza?
I will indeed speak. I'm grateful to my honourable friend for giving way, and I know that some of the questions that have been asked of us today have been, how do we know what's going to happen if there is a ceasefire? Does she agree that the real problem is that we know exactly what's going to happen if there's not a ceasefire, and that alone should be enough to make sure they vote for one tonight?
Hear, hear. I thank him for his point, and that point is absolutely crucial. If there is no ceasefire, as we continue as we are just now, we know what the consequences of that will be. The consequences of that will be thousands more people will die. We don't have to question that. We know that that will happen. And it is on our conscience if we choose not to act. Madam Deputy Speaker, I have never had more emails about an issue, and I know that is common for many colleagues around this House. Currently, over 3,000 people have got in touch with me about this issue. The ongoing demonstrations outside this House and in towns and villages and cities across these islands shows the strength of feeling on the conflict in Gaza, bringing together people from all backgrounds, people who have never protested before, but who see an injustice happening and they want us, as parliamentarians, to do something about it. We all know that peace can be possible, but that it starts with tentative steps. Ceasefires are not easy. The honourable members from Foyle and Belfast South gave their experiences, and other colleagues brought dispatches from their conversations and visits in the region. We are under no illusions of the challenges, but we must try. In this place, we have a duty, we have an obligation, a very special obligation when it comes to the Middle East. And every moment we delay and equivocate, more people die. It could not be more crucial than that. This is not a debate about semantics or procedure, it is about principle. It is about the people of Gaza. It is about saving lives. The hostages must be released. Aid must be allowed in. Negotiations must begin. And it is on our consciences, on all of our consciences here in this place. If we do not stand with our international partners, with countries around the world, with international aid organisations, with the United Nations, we must have a ceasefire, and we must have a ceasefire now.